A day after the announcement from Russia of President Putin's victory in the Russian presidential elections, there continues to be very bitter commentary in the West about the election result. But let me, first of all, before I discuss all of that, correct an incorrect piece of information that I gave yesterday. There were lots of reports on the internet yesterday and the day before that the Pope had congratulated President Putin on his election. The Vatican has now released a statement saying this is not true, that this is fake news. I wonder who was behind this particular leak. But anyway, it appears that contrary to what I said in my program yesterday, the Pope has not, in fact, congratulated Putin on his election. Thinking about it, I don't recall that the Pope, who is after all a religious leader, though he is the head of state of Vatican City State, I don't recall that the Pope does generally congratulate leaders on winning elections. And, well, anyway, one way or the other, the fact is he hasn't congratulated Putin. But let's get back to the echoing responses after Putin's election victory. Well, for me, the mood is summed up by two statements that have been made over the last 24 hours. One came from the German Foreign Ministry, led by that consummate diplomat, Annalena Baerbock. They've confirmed that obviously they don't accept the results of the Russian presidential election and that they don't refer to the leader of Russia as President Putin. They just call him Putin. A curious, bizarre device intended to delegitimize him in some way. Again, it's petulant and silly, but very much in the style of Annalena Baerbock, what the Germans think about President Putin's election ultimately is neither here nor there. It is what opinion in Russia feels about President Putin's election. And on that topic, there's been a fine video by Brian Belletti, who makes a point which others also have made, and which perhaps ought to be made more strongly than it is, which is that the outcome of the Russian presidential election is consistent, fully consistent with polling data, including polling data from Russian polling agencies and polling agencies that are either critical of President Putin or strongly opposed to him in some cases, and which historically have received funding from the West. There's no reason, as I said yesterday, to doubt that this election is an accurate reflection of the state of public opinion in Russia today. As I said in my program yesterday, if one takes a step back, thinks through the events of the last 2 years, we've seen a massive economic war being waged by the West against Russia. We have seen a proxy war waged against Russia in Ukraine, a proxy war where American officials, including Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, have openly spoken about the need, the fact that this war is being used to weaken Russia. It's been discussed extensively in that way in the United States. We've had commentaries from all sorts of Western officials about the need to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. These started even before the fighting actually began. I still remember Boris Johnson coming out and saying that Russia must lose and be seen to lose. So all of this taken together has convinced Russians that their country is under siege by the West, and anybody with any knowledge of Russia and of Russian history would expect that that kind of action from the West would bring about a consolidation of Russian society behind President Putin and his government. The fact that President Putin and his government have successfully navigated through the sanctions war and have delivered what looks like the early stages of an economic boom, and the fact that Russia is winning the war on the battlefronts, well, that has just provided a further reason to support President Putin at this particular point of time. This phenomenon of people rallying behind a government in wartime is very well known. It happens repeatedly throughout history. I remember, for example, way back as a student, reading about parliamentary elections that took place in Prussia in 1866 during the Prussian-Austrian War, which produced a landslide victory for Bismarck's conservatives in the Prussian Landtag. There is absolutely nothing unusual or remarkable about this. So, just saying. Anyway, the other bitter comment that I am going to just briefly mention, but the one which I think sums up the mood in the West perhaps most accurately, is an angry editorial that has appeared in the Daily Telegraph, and it says that Putin, the title of it is, Putin now appears more entrenched than ever. And I think that is absolutely correct. That is exactly what has happened. Putin is indeed in a stronger position than he has ever been. And you get the sense of anger, and I think in some respects, the sense of powerlessness from the last words of this editorial. It is more than 2 years since the invasion was supposed to see Russians sitting in Kiev's cafes within days, and then their abject military failure was expected to bring about the swift demise of Putin. Yet many thousands of casualties later, he is still there, seemingly stronger than ever, with all internal opposition crushed. The best response to this travesty is for NATO to fully get behind Ukraine and provide the armaments it needs to undermine Putin's election triumph with a military calamity. Well, if the last had been possible, achieving a military calamity with respect to the Russian army in Ukraine, we would have had it by now. What was last summer's Ukrainian offensive other than a massive attempt to achieve that very thing? And it failed completely. Failure being, of course, the word that Westerners like to use when they describe the Ukrainian offensive. I prefer the more accurate word, the militarily more accurate word, which is defeat. Anyway, so much for that. Let's talk about what the political developments in Russia are. I've spoken about how the election, the presidential election in Russia, needs to be seen as a referendum on President Putin. I've spoken about how the presidential candidates who stood against Putin understood this and essentially were not aiming to beat him. And in fact, reflecting the way in which President Putin sought to consolidate Russian society, reflecting the way in which the election, the presidential election itself, has been used by the Kremlin to consolidate Russian society. Putin, after the election, after his victory, called in the four presidential candidates he ran against to a meeting in the Kremlin. They all had what appears to have been a very polite meeting, and then Putin brought them to Red Square, where there was a rally commemorating the 10th anniversary of Crimea's unification, as the Russians would say, annexation, as the West and the Ukrainians like to say, with Russia. And all four of these candidates made brief addresses to the crowd, which was there with Russian flags. Anyway, all four of these candidates made brief addresses, all of which essentially were supportive of the union, let's call it a union, the union of Crimea with Russia, and indirectly of the war effort. I should say, though, and here I come back to the fact that there were rival candidates standing against Putin, even if none of them seemed particularly interested in winning. But anybody who really did not want Putin to win in the election was not without a choice. They could, of course, have voted for one of these candidates. Some, of course, did. Apparently around 15% of the voters voted for other of these candidates. And it's probably fair to say that Vladislav Davankov, who was one of these candidates, he seems to have been perhaps somewhat more open or slightly more distant in his support from the war than the others. And if you wanted to register an anti-war vote, well, you had the option to abstain or to vote for him. And it doesn't seem that many people did either, though perhaps it's worth saying that around 23% of Russians abstained in the election, 15% voted for opposition candidates. That is a substantial number of people if you add them all up. And that, of course, is on the basis of the official figures. Anyway, there is no doubt Putin commands high popularity in Russia, and Western policy has made it so. Western policy, ever since the end of the Soviet Union, the horrors of the 1990s, the intense meddling in Russian political affairs that took place during that time, the violation of the promises not to extend NATO eastwards, the support for the Maidan movement in Ukraine and its illegal overthrow of the constitutionally elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, the support for the anti-terrorist operation that the newly installed Ukrainian government launched against Donbas in the spring of 2014, the fierce fighting that took place, the violation of the Minsk II agreement, which is openly admitted by all sides, the recent admissions by Merkel and Hollande that whatever the original intention that those two people had, the Minsk agreement over time became a device to buy Ukraine time, and that the German and French governments were complicit in this fact. All of this, as I said, has had an effect of consolidating Russian society behind Putin. And of course, the actions of the Western powers since the conflict began, since the special military operation began in February 2022, have intensified that trend. Why, for example, what was achieved precisely by the decision to prevent flights from Russia accessing European airspace, preventing Russians from traveling to the West. Was that not the clearest signal to Russians that the West doesn't like them generically, and doesn't want them? Anyway, I'm going to leave this topic now. I think I've said enough about it. Whether or not the West like the fact that Putin is there, whether or not Foreign Minister Baerbock can't bring to refer to President Putin by his formal title, that is President, but must instead still insist on referring to him as just Putin, whether they like it or not, they will have to eventually come to terms with this fact that Putin is indeed there and accept the fact that he is the leader, the widely supported leader of Russia, with the consent of a large majority of its people. Now, that, by the way, reminds me of a scene right at the beginning of Sergei Eisenstein's film Ivan the Terrible, Part 1. This is in 2 parts. There's a scene in which Ivan, who is Grand Prince of Moscow, has himself crowned Tsar of Russia, the first Russian ruler to assume that title, Tsar of Russia being, of course, equivalent to Emperor of Russia. And you have all the Western ambassadors watching this conversation and whispering to each other, should we recognize it? And one of them says, if he's powerful enough, we'll have to recognize it. And that's exactly what we see is happening with Putin now. Whether they like the fact or not, they will have to recognize that he is indeed the president of Russia and deal with that fact. Anyway, let's move on. We have had some important news from the front lines, and this predictably comes from the Avdiivka area. I haven't yet seen the confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense, but apparently the Russian Ministry of Defense is now confirming that Orlovka has been brought fully under Russian control. At least this is what the news agency, the official Russian news agency, TASS, is telling us. And it is likely that at some point over the next couple of hours, we'll be obtaining further confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry's website and its Telegram channel. And there are also reports cascading in from various reporters on the ground that the Ukrainians have now been forced to withdraw completely, not just from Orlovka, but from Tonenka to the south, that these 2 villages are now fully under Russian control. Fighting still continues in Berdichi, further north, but if one looks at the map and one looks at Russian positions to the north of Berdichi and to the south of Berdichi, with Orlovka now under Russian control, I personally cannot see how the Ukrainians can hold on to Berdichi, or at least any part of Berdichi. The Russians control probably most of Berdichi already. Anyway, I personally cannot see how the Ukrainians can continue to hold to any part of Berdichi for much longer. And presumably, over the next few hours, they will be pulling out of Berdichi as well. And that means the collapse of Ukraine's latest defense line, the one that General Syrskyi quickly cobbled together west of Avdiivka after the fall of the village of Lastochkino, west of Avdiivka, but east of these 3 villages, Tonenka, Orlovka, and Berdichi. Now, the question then becomes, what next are the Russians going to do? They will probably, or so it seems to me, advance along territory to the south of Tonenka. They will occupy various villages there, Stepnoye and the others, and that will probably eventually bring them up to a water barrier, which many suppose will be the next Ukrainian defense line. My own view is that they will not immediately seek to cross that water barrier. I think that more consistent with Russian actions is that they will then act to finish the Battle of Pervomaisky, town of 28,000 people before the war. Further south, the Russians control perhaps 60% of this town. They will want to complete its capture. They've not so far undertaken heavy bombing of this town, at least not, I haven't seen any pictures suggesting that they have done so up to this point, but I suspect that they will want to finish the capture of Pervomaisky. They captured about a week ago the village of Nivolskoye, further south from Pervomaisky. When Pervomaisky falls, it seems to me that Ukrainian positions further south still in the contested town of Krasnogorovka, town of about 14,000 people, it's likely that that town will also fall. So we will see all of these places, Pervomaisky, Krasnogorovka, they'll all start to fall like a row of dominoes. And that will then position the Russians in a strong position to move further towards Kurakovo, down to the southwest, and once Kurakovo falls, the position of the Ukrainian forces in Vuhledar starts to collapse as well. So again, we go back to the analogy of dominoes or drafts, checkers as I prefer. Going back to December, the Russians consolidated control of Marinka. Marinka has enabled them to launch, control of Marinka has enabled them to launch attacks to the north, towards Krasnogorovka, to the west, towards Georgievka, to the south, towards Novomikhailovka. At the same time, they have, in February, they were able to capture Avdiivka to the north, capturing Marinka and Avdiivka, one after the other, has put them in a strong position to capture Pervomaisky, Kurakovo, Krasnogorovka, and ultimately Vuhledar. All the remaining major fortified positions held by Ukraine southwest in southern western Donbas. And then beyond that, if the Russians push on from Avdiivka north up the railway lines and capture Ocheretino, which I suspect will also be a further objective, then that leads to various other possibilities to the eventual capture of the important town of Pakrovsk in western, south, the very western edge of this area of Donbas, and at that point, the way is open. Should they choose to advance towards the Dnieper River in this direction. And something very similar is happening a little bit further north, and we again see how the game of checkers works. So, last summer, the Russians captured Bakhmut, a very difficult, grueling battle, perhaps the most difficult battle in the war so far, one where the victory should be always remembered was achieved by the Wagner Group, who, in the process, perfected understanding of how to carry out attacks on these fortified towns. Anyway, the Russians captured Bakhmut. The capture of Bakhmut could not be exploited at that time because the Russians had to deal with Ukraine's summer offensive. But over the last few weeks, the Russians have resumed the advance in Bakhmut. A couple of months ago, they captured Khromovo to the northwest of Bakhmut. They've now been conducting intense fighting to capture the two further villages to the west, very heavily fortified villages, Ivanivska and Bogdanovka. I understand that most of Ivanivska is now under Russian control. The Russians have been bombing intensively in this area for weeks now. The fall of Bakhmut, the capture of these two further villages, three further villages, Khromovo, Bogdanovka and Ivanivska, opens the way to the capture of Chasiv Yar. That's the next piece to take, big piece to take. Town of around 12,000 people before the war began. Chasiv Yar opens the way for the capture of Konstantinovka, and then once Konstantinovka is captured, the way is open to launch a further attack northwards towards the much bigger town of Kramatorsk, 150,000 people, biggest town in Donbas, still under Ukrainian control, part of the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk conurbation. And here again, we see how the capture of Bakhmut last year and the capture of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk back in 2022 opens the way for a simultaneous attack, eventually on the northern spur of this conurbation on Slavyansk. And the Russians are starting the preliminary moves to do that very thing. So I've been discussing in various programs the gradual Russian offensive towards the Zherebets River, edging slowly towards the village of Terskoy on the Zherebets River. There were many reports at one time that the Russians had captured the village. It seems they've made no attempt to do so, but they have been shelling and bombing Ukrainian defenses along the Zherebets River. Once the Zherebets River line is captured, which it will be fairly soon, the Russians then have the option to cross the Zherebets River. The Zherebets River line can then opens the way west towards the town of Liman. Liman facilitates a Russian attack towards Slavyansk from the east. And the Russians, meanwhile, are gathering forces for a potential advance to Slavyansk from the north as well. And over the last couple of days, the Russians have been reactivating their front line in the Siversk area. This is in northern Donbas. Siversk being a heavily fortified town to the west of Lysychansk. The Russians made an attempt to capture it in the summer of 2022. Again, it had to be called off as the Russians prepared to deal with the autumn offensives that Ukraine launched in Kharkiv and Kherson region. The advance towards Siversk then resumed. Some weeks ago, the Russians captured a small number of important positions to the south of Siversk. They've been making probing attacks, or that's what they seem to me to be, towards a small town called Belogorodka to the east of Siversk. They've been bombing Ukrainian positions in Siversk and Belogorovka extremely heavily, it seems to me that the next plan will probably be to capture Belogorovka and then Siversk itself. And then, of course, probably at that point, the Russians will reactivate their forces in Kharkiv region, reactivate the offensive towards Kupiansk, and then at that point, the way becomes open to launch an attack on Slavyansk from the north. So it all sounds complicated and intricate, but when you look at the geography of Donbas and the forces that each side has committed to the battle, you could see how it all plays out. Now, I want to say that Dima at the Military Summary Channel, in a recent program, spoke about the number of forces that the Ukrainians have concentrated in Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians have been fearing for some time a Russian offensive. There's been lots of talk and rumors that the Russians are preparing to launch a massive offensive in the Kharkiv area with the ultimate objective of attacking Kharkiv. Now, this has not yet happened, but it turns out that in the area from Kupiansk and Kharkiv itself and to the north of Kharkiv, the Ukrainians have positioned around 50 brigades of their army. That's a force of about 100 to 150,000 men. Half the Ukrainian army is located at this time in Kharkiv region. And I'm going to suggest, again, that putting aside the question of whether the Russians really do intend to launch a big offensive in Kharkiv region, the mere rumor that they are, and the extent to which the Ukrainians would see that apparently as existential for themselves, has in effect pinned down the Ukrainian army in Kharkiv region, even as in central Donbas, in the Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka area, Ukrainian positions collapse. Half the Ukrainian army is now in effect standing idle, being constantly bombed and shelled by the Russians, waiting for an attack, which no doubt will eventually come, but which the Russians presumably will launch at their leisure. And yesterday, I read an account in the London Times about the desperately heavy losses that the Ukrainians are suffering in the Kupiansk area, and how a Ukrainian soldier who is involved in that fighting complained about the fact that under the relentless Russian attacks around Kupiansk, the situation for the Ukrainians is so bad that they can't even evacuate their dead. So we can see, I think, the general picture of where the battle is going, but for the moment, the big emphasis on the part of the Russians appears to be exploiting the breach that they've punched through Ukrainian defenses, which they achieved through the capture of Avdiivka, and which they intend to follow up, I suspect, in the ways that I've described. Bear in mind that the more of Donbas the Russians control, the more forces they have to attack the Ukrainians in other places. And that isn't even taking into account the huge build-up of the Russian army that continues to take place within Russia itself. So that's my brief, inexpert overview of the war. Now, there has been a brilliant article by Alex Vashinin, published by the Royal United Services Institute. Alex Vashinin is one of the most insightful commentators about the war, and has been so right from the outset. He was one of the first people to point out to the industrial nature of this type of war. And anyway, he's been gone for a long time, but now he is back. And he's written this astounding piece, full of insight, for the Royal United Services Institute. And it goes by the title, The Attritional Art of War, Lessons from the Russian War on Ukraine. And one of the most interesting things about this article is that it describes the war that the Russians have been fighting, aggressive attrition, as I like to call it, in immense and scholarly detail. It's the most erudite article altogether. And as I said, it's full of insights. But when you actually read it, Vashinin actually doesn't discuss the war itself at all. He does so by allusion rather than by description. So he talks about the fighting that's going on, but without actually referencing any battles, for example. When he does reference battles, well, he talks about the Brusilov offensive, which the Russians launched in 1916. He talks about the Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, which the Russians and the Germans fought during the Second World War in 1942 and 1943. He talks about Verdun, the battle fought between the Germans and the French during the First World War in 1916. But he doesn't actually discuss, so far as I can see, a single battle in the current fighting in Ukraine itself. I wonder what happened. I mean, the title of the article speaks about lessons from the Russian war on Ukraine, but it does seem odd that he doesn't actually talk about the battle in Ukraine itself. I wonder whether there hasn't been some degree of editorial intervention here, and that RUSI, which is, after all, connected to the British Army, told Vashinin to avoid discussing the fighting in Ukraine itself, because that was too sensitive and perhaps for the British too distressing a topic. Just to get a sense, by the way, of how distressing it is, yesterday, the Daily Telegraph, one of the newspapers, mainstream newspapers here in Britain, which takes a fervently pro-Ukrainian perspective of the war. Anyway, it reported that rogue Russian troops, as it referred to them, now as dissident Russian troops, who are supposed to be the troops who are fighting on the Ukrainian side against the Russians. Anyway, that those rogue Russian troops had captured the Russian village of Kozinka in Belgorod region and raised their flag over it. Now, this is a great surprise to me, because I'd seen no report to that effect, that the Ukrainians, let's dispense with the idea that there are rogue Russian troops involved. Let's dispense with that. I'd seen no reports from any Russian telegram channel or any other such place that Kozinka had indeed fallen under Ukrainian control. And in fact, this morning, we've actually had film from Kozinka itself, and this village is securely under Russian control. So probably, presumably, what happened is that in the usual way, the Ukrainians got their dissident Russian, proxies, pretend proxies, to make this claim that Kozinka is under their control. The Daily Telegraph republished that claim, accepting that it was true, and we've now had confirmation that it is not, but you are not going to get a retraction from the Daily Telegraph. By the way, talking about Ukrainian claims, the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces, Yuri Ignat, who's been a very, very regular commentator on Ukrainian media, and who, by the way, I have found to be an interesting man. One always gets the sense that he's been pushed into saying things and making claims that he basically knows are not true. But anyway, Yuri Ignat has now been sacked sometime after the commander of the Ukrainian Air Defense Forces was also sacked. I wonder whether this is a product of all those claims that were widespread a couple of weeks ago about the Ukrainians shooting down dozens of Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, Russian fighter bombers. I said that at the time that I was deeply skeptical about those claims, about the claims that two A-50 AWACS aircraft had been shot down and that dozens of Sukhoi 34s had been shot down. I see no evidence, no corroborating evidence that this was the case, that it seemed to me that if this was the case, we would see some slackening in operations by the Russian Air Force. There is no sign of any slackening of operations by the Russian Air Force. By the way, a Ukrainian officer has come forward now and said that over the course of the fighting in the conflict since the 1st of January of this year, since then, over the last 3 months, the Russians have dropped more than 3,500 precision-guided bombs on Ukraine, which is 16 times more than the total of the bombs that the Russians dropped over Ukraine in 2023. Just saying. But anyway, I was skeptical about all of those claims that the Ukrainians were shooting down all those fighter jets. I think it is now widely accepted that those claims were not true. And anyway, it looks like both the commander of the Air Defense Forces and the chief spokesman, Yuri Ignat, who I think was sometimes embarrassed at having to make these far-fetched claims. Anyway, it looks as if they've both been sacked, as the absurdity of these claims has been exposed. I come back to what I'm saying. The Daily Telegraph, the British media, the Western media have been far too willing to assume that Ukrainian stories that come from the battlefronts are true. I still wonder whether the same might be the case of some of the ship losses that the Russians are supposed to have suffered in the Black Sea. A couple of days ago, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. This is after reports that the commander of the Black Sea Fleet has been sacked and replaced by the commander of Russia's elite Northern Fleet, who presumably is a rather more experienced and talented officer. And Shoigu went to the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters and gave instructions that warships of the Black Sea Fleet needed to be provided with more protection against water drones, and he spoke about installing large numbers of heavy caliber machine guns on ships, Black Sea Fleet ships, in order to destroy water drones. And many have taken these events as confirmation about these claims of ship losses by the Russians. That might be true, but it seems to me more a response from the Russians to the loss of the Ivan Kotov, the rather modern, advanced corvette that was undoubtedly sunk by the Ukrainians a few weeks ago. It's one of the few cases when one can definitely say that this loss took place. There seems to have been a shock to the Russian command. It led to the sacking, as I said, of the admiral in charge of the Black Sea Fleet. And the sailors of the Ivan Kotov said that they were overwhelmed by an attack of 7 water drones acting in concert. There were just too many drones to destroy. And that looks to me to be the reason why Shoigu came and ordered that there had to be more machine guns deployed on these ships, because it is the machine guns, the heavy machine guns, that the Russians use to destroy the water drones as they approach these ships. So it looks to me specifically as a response to the loss of the Ivan Kotov. But anyway, the point is, Ukraine makes all kinds of false claims. The Russians make false claims too. This is a war. One shouldn't fall for them all the time. One shouldn't assume that what either side says in a particular battle is necessarily true. The Russian Defense Ministry generally is careful to provide us with confirmed information, but even they have stretched it sometimes. So one should be careful accepting reports from battlefronts from either side. The Western media never does that. And in the case of RUSI, publishing this article from Alex Vashinin, they don't seem to be too keen that he actually discussed in any kind of detail what really happened in the various battles that have taken place in Ukraine. Anyway, coming back to Alex Vashinin and his article, which is really quite brilliant. Vashinin goes on to say, if the West is serious about the possibility of a great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its capacity to wage a protracted war and to pursue a strategy focused on attrition rather than maneuver. And then he goes on to say, attritional wars require their own art of war and are fought with a force-centric approach, unlike wars of maneuver which are terrain-focused. They are rooted in massive industrial capacity to replace losses, geographical depth to absorb defeats, and technological conditions that prevent rapid ground movement. In attritional wars, military operations are shaped by a state's ability to replace losses and generate new formations, not tactical and operational maneuvers. The side that accepts the attritional nature of war and focuses on destroying enemy forces rather than gaining terrain is more likely to win. Going all the way back to the start of the war, we did a program, Alex Christoforou and me, in which we discussed Russian strategy. We discussed how it was ultimately Clausewitzian, and we said that the principal objective of the Russians in this war was the destruction of the Ukrainian army. Destroying Ukrainian armies was more important for the Russians than capturing Ukrainian cities, places like Kiev and Kharkiv. Once the army, Ukraine's army, is destroyed, and its ability to conduct the war is ended, then all the cities will simply fall into Russia's lap. And that is what Vershinin is telling us. And he goes on to say that the West is not prepared for this kind of war. To most Western experts, attritional strategy is counterintuitive. Historically, the West prefers the short winner-takes-all clash of professional armies. Recent war games, such as CSIS's war over Taiwan, covered 1 month of fighting. The possibility that war would go on never entered the discussion. This is a reflection of common Western attitudes. And then he discusses the war in immense detail. He discusses the economic dimension, the need for massive industrial processes to produce weapons. He goes on to say that in order to be most effective, you need a high-low mix of weapons. You need advanced tanks like the T-90M and perhaps in time the T-14 Armata. The Russians have been talking a lot more about the T-Armata recently, which suggests that perhaps we are going to see it on the front lines before very long. Anyway, you need advanced tanks, you need advanced machines operating on the wall because they're force multipliers. But you also need mass. As he puts it, it is easier and faster to produce large numbers of cheap weapons and munitions, especially if their subcomponents are interchangeable with civilian goods, ensuring mass quantity without the expansion of production lines. And if you go to Jim Kinnair's book, you will find again that this is absolutely the Russian strategy, that these huge Russian factories, like Ural Vagon Zavod, for example, which produces the tanks, they also make railway equipment. But the machine tools that can be used to make railway rolling stock can also be used to make tanks. And the tanks are simple and easy to produce, taking those industrial realities into account. And then he also talks about achieving mass is difficult for high-end Western economies, and to achieve hyper efficiency, they shed excess capacity and struggle to rapidly expand. And I've discussed many times my own brief experiences of Russian factories and of their extremely low capacity utilization in peacetime conditions, which enables them to surge hugely in wartime, as we are now seeing. Western factories operate in a completely different way to a Western mind, allowing machine tools and shop floors to remain idle is economically inefficient and doesn't happen. But as Vershinin points out, in big attritional peer-level war, that is precisely what you need to do. And he talks about that, how doing this also requires large pool of skilled workers. And he says that in the West, there is now a critical shortage of these. And he references a US government interagency report from 2018, highlighting the lack of industrial capacity and of a skilled workforce. He then goes into an even more controversial discussion about armed forces organization. He discusses how the Soviet system was based on rapid expansion of the Soviet army, and that it was this which accounted for the lack of highly trained NCOs. Actually, as I've said, this is something of a myth. From the early 1970s, the Soviets did start to make a serious effort to create a professional NCO cadre, and apparently with some success. But anyway, overall, the Russians, because they were focused with creating mass, and as Vershinin says, mass in attritional war is what wins. Their approach was officer-centric rather than NCO-centric. And this would have given the Soviet army the numbers it needed to prevail in an attritional war. And he says that the best and optimal solution is to have highly trained to the Western level, professional contract forces with NCOs and all of that, but alongside them operate units capable of massive expansion. And again, that is exactly what the Russians are doing, that this is exactly the way that they're starting to organize their forces today. And then he makes some very interesting points about how war, attritional war, should actually be conducted on battlefields. He said that one of the most important things to do is to conserve force, not to waste your forces. And that might sometimes mean accepting the need for retreats, because in attrition war, retaining control of territory is not so important when your objective is to destroy the enemy's army. And again, that's exactly what we repeatedly see the Russians do. And the better way to achieve results in attritional war, in fact, the only way to achieve results in attritional war, is not through complex tactics and maneuvers, which are likely to be extremely costly to your own side and might not be achievable. Their results might not be achievable at all, unless, of course, you have forces that outnumber those of the enemy by multiples. The better thing to do, instead, is to launch multiple attacks right across the front line and to launch shallow attacks that cumulatively cause the enemy's forces to cascade and break down. And then he says things like, only after meeting the various criteria for launching offensive operations, in other words, a significant build-up of forces, and he describes how that would work. First phase is to basically go into positional warfare, don't launch offensives at all, spend time building up your forces. Then once you are able to do that, you should concentrate on attrition. You wait until the enemy's strategic reserve is exhausted, leaving it unable to reinforce the threatened sector, achieve fire and reconnaissance superiority, degrade the enemy's industrial sector. But then you launch your offensive, but you do so across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks. The intent is to remain inside a layered bubble of friendly protective systems while stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. Only then should the offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the enemy rear. Concentration of forces on one main front should be avoided, as this gives an indication of the offensive's location and an opportunity for the enemy to concentrate their reserves against this key point. And again, this is exactly what we're seeing. In fact, there's been an article in Le Figaro French newspaper, which says that the Russians are tormenting the Ukrainians at the moment by attacking in various different directions along this huge contact line at various points, keeping the Ukrainians constantly guessing at what the Russians intend to do, preserving for the Russians the strategic initiative, opening the way for eventual cascade collapse. And then Vershinin also says that it is important not to allow oneself to become obsessed with any particular position, enemy position, and he warns about the mistake the Germans made in Stalingrad in 1943, 1942, 43, where they overcommitted to the capture of Stalingrad. The same being true of the Germans in Verdun, when they tried to capture Verdun, that one should never overinvest or overcommit in any one location. And by the way, that is as true of the defense as it is of the offense. And he said that this is how attrition wars ultimately are won. And he talks about integration of these overlapping assets requires centralized planning and exceptionally well-trained staff officers. He might be talking here about General Gerasimov and of the Russian General Staff, capable of integrating multiple capabilities on the fly. And of course, the Russian General Staff is geared to doing precisely these kind of things. And he says it takes years to train such officers, and even combat experience does not generate such skills in a short time. And he then goes into great detail about the huge complexity of operations and the need for deep missile and artillery and airstrikes behind the enemy's rear to continue to disrupt their operations, their ability to reinforce the front line and to keep it supplied, so that the degrading of their forces is eventually achieved. And then there is a paragraph which is particularly highlighted. Victory in an attritional war is assured by careful planning, industrial-based development, and development of mobilization infrastructure in times of peace, and even more careful management of resources in wartime. And he doesn't quite say this, but it's clear that he thinks that the Russians have perfected this approach to war, that the Russian General Staff are the outstanding exponents of it, and he makes it very clear that he doesn't think that the Western powers are anywhere close to thinking of war in these terms, which is why they are losing in Ukraine. And he talks about the fact that the West needs to rethink its battle strategies to try to resolve these challenges. But then I'm going to say straight away, when you think about it, when you take a step back and look at Western societies today, you quickly understand that it is impossible for the West to change its mode of war in the way that Vershinin is suggesting. How can the West achieve something like this? Vershinin is talking about rebuilding Western industrial capacities. He makes it clear that this isn't just military industries. The whole civilian industry needs to be capable of sustaining an attritional war. He says that you need a huge skilled workforce to be able to operate in these factory conditions. You need centralized planning to control mobilization of industrial assets. And you need, obviously, it's good to have a high quality cadre-based, contract-based professional army. But you need a huge mobilization reserve based on conscription alongside it. How is the West going to achieve all of that? What Vershinin is in effect saying is that for the West to win in conventional wars against adversaries like the Russians, they would have to fundamentally change the whole nature of Western society and Western economy and Western political systems. And I cannot believe that that can be done. The United States, Britain, in the 1940s would have had the ability to wage war in this way, though probably, well, indeed, undoubtedly, not to the level that the Soviets were able to do at that time. But to ask of our societies today, based on just-in-time manufacturing systems, severely pared down, depending heavily on imports, with economies structured more around services and financial management, with political systems that discount industrial planning, and with societies which have been turning away from conscription, so that even in countries with martial traditions like France, Britain, and the United States, there is a recruitment crisis and an inability to find young men to enroll in the army. Well, changing this to achieve the kind of outcome that Vershinin is talking about, it would require nothing short of a political and socio-economic revolution. And no one in the West is dreaming even of such a thing. So, what is the lesson to be drawn from all of this? Well, it's a short one. Don't take the Russians on in war. They are certainly in the Western Hemisphere the best at this sort of thing. Taking them on in war is a fruitless exercise. We have seen this repeatedly. We've seen the consolidation of Russian society that Western pressure has achieved. That is the result of the election. And we see how the Russian industrial, political, and military machine is geared towards war in a way that no Western country or Western society is. And that ought to be obvious. Now, it doesn't follow from this, and it needs reiterating, that the Russians have a plan to conquer Europe or the West or the world or anything of that nature. The Russians have developed this system because their history has impressed upon them the need for proficiency in war. But there is no real sign that the Russians are aggressive and that they want to extend their power westwards. What the lesson from all of this is to just accept the realities that the Russians are not going to be defeated in war. Try to avoid getting into armed confrontations with them, either through proxy wars or other such things, and to seek long-term, viable political compromises with them, as was attempted during the détente era in the 1960s and early 70s with a great deal of success. Vershinin is telling us that that is the only way. And he is right. The lesson of the Ukraine war, and by the way, of this presidential election, which we have just seen, also is telling us the same thing. Now, what are the alternatives? cruel demands from Lindsey Graham, just gone to Ukraine, that Ukraine call up everybody. Ledvard Lutvak saying that the Ukrainians need to call up their young men from the age of 18, have the small cohort, desperately short cohort of young men in Ukraine massacred on the battlefields. This is not wise. It is not right. It is not the way forward. It is taking on the Russians at what they do best and which the West has no means to emulate. Political compromise is the way. That may mean accepting that President Putin is in Russia as its leader to stay. It may mean accepting Russian security concerns about their western borders, which are perfectly legitimate. It may mean giving up the fantastic plans of breaking up Russia and turning it into a great chessboard and doing those sort of things. But, in my opinion, those plans were sinister and wrong anyway, and the sooner they're abandoned, the better for everyone. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where we are giving a 15% discount on shirts. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.